Thank you everyone for taking time to be here today. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about who SGS is, but I will briefly let you know. Then we'll talk about 5 North American drivers for ESG and sustainability, 6 business challenges, 3 aspects of strategy to assess, and different tools for assessing each of those aspects, and then how to pick tools that fit your needs. So I'm going to break it down in a lot further than it usually gets broken down. So we'll talk about the things you can take that fit your position as a company, your particular drivers, your particular situation, your particular industry. So let's get into it. If you have not heard of SGS, hopefully you have. We're the world's leading inspection, verification, testing, and certification company. We've been around for 140 plus years. We have a footprints, we like to say boots on the ground around the world. We have sustainability and has been embedded into the company culture for a very long time, from the CEO to the auditors on the ground. We just have been doing this for a while. It's not our first rodeo. 25 years in the sustainability service industry as well. We've been members of a lot of initiatives starting from scratch. We've helped develop criteria, schemes, where we participate in a lot of these activities around the globe, and we also deliver these services, and we continue to do so and try to be at the forefront. And we get recognized for that. If you look at any of the agencies that will rate you on your performance, we do get rated and rated well by all of them, and we're very proud of that leadership. And that's it, enough about us. The first question, just to see who we have in the room, make sure you're engaged. This is it's a good barometer question to just see where you're at, because you don't have to do this, but it's a good tell of where you're at in the process. Does your organization publish an annual ESG or sustainability report? And so I'm sending that out to you now, and I'm going to let you all take a look. Take a few moments. Hopefully you know the answer. Be honest. If you don't know the answer, it's not a bad thing. You'll be in good company. But it's just a good sense to get a sense of where you're at. And as we go through this, I'll ask you more of these questions that just kind of help you position yourself in your journey. So I'll give you a few more seconds to think about it. It could be called a sustainability report, a social impact report. It could be, CSR report, ESG report, sustainability report. If it's published and it happens annually, that's really what we're looking for. So 5 more seconds. We got a lot of people participating, so thank you. Right now, we got a lot of no, majority knows, some I don't knows, and it kind of balances out. But I'll send those results out to everyone so you can see. But this is really common. A sustainability report takes a lot of work, takes a lot of effort. You have to be organized, and you do end up doing it pretty much annually. I have seen some do it semi-annually or biannually, every other year, I should say, to be more accurate. And that works, but it is work. Just the reporting itself takes effort, but it is a fantastic vehicle to get your word out and for you to know that you're tracking and measuring the right things. And let's talk about why people do this work. So I'm going to talk about North America. Obviously, there are other drivers. If you think about the United States and Canada, that's where our market largely is. We are typically thought of as behind, about 5 years behind Europe, South America, East Asia. But we still have the same similar drivers, even if they're not as aggressive. ESG ratings, it's a very specific market, but if you are a publicly traded company, it's been several years, you have been getting an ESG rating from an agency, whether it's DJSI and you're very large, or MSCI, ISS, Sustainalytics, and now, very recently, in the last few years, EcoVadis has really taken off. And if you're privately held, you might be getting rated by them, which we'll talk about next. But the one that has the most teeth, and that has had the most teeth, people often talk about ESG as a finance issue from investors. Those ratings have been at play for quite a few years. So that's pretty much the number one driver with teeth in North America. However, supply chain customers are quickly following. So if you are in the supply chain of a larger customer and they are being rated on their ESG, and their investors and others are interested in pressuring them to do good, then you have likely received a request or a mandate from a supplier to say, we need you to start disclosing. And EcoVadis and CDP are the 2 most popular, but those trickle down into very small, medium-sized, privately held companies. And that's a big lever that has made ESG and sustainability reach out into a much broader base of businesses. In North America, regulation is not and has not been that strong. If we talk about local regulation, the reality is regulation in East Asia, South America, and Europe especially has impacted North American businesses because they have a supply chain and they do businesses overseas. Local regulation is very limited. The USA has been in the news lately. The two things that are really specific to climate change, not broader ESG issues, but just climate disclosure, have been the federal supplier rule that just happened recently at the last COP27 and took effect, I believe, at the end of January. And that's for suppliers to the US federal government. And then there's a proposed US SEC ruling that is still in the courts and is likely and expected to be approved at some level with changes sometime at the end of the year. And so those are not ESG regulations. I just reiterate, it's really ESG is the broad environmental social governance. These are all climate disclosure regulations. So you usually see people taking a lot of action on climate first and then trying to understand the broader ESG. And then consumers, these are definitely a distant fourth and fifth, but consumers, if you're in the consumer market, directly to individuals and your customers are demanding it at a higher and higher percentage every year. That's just the reality. There's a niche market called the low-cost lifestyles of health and sustainability consumer base that is a huge growing market around the globe, and it's increasing as a percentage of the overall market in most major countries. And that it just means that they're willing to pay more for a product that is environmentally and or socially responsible. And if there's price parity and two things cost the same amount, that they would rather pick the other product that is socially or environmentally responsible. And last, but I don't think it's going away, especially in white collar, high skilled positions and leadership positions, it's even more so because they can choose where to go. But employees are choosing and desire to work for companies that are environmentally and socially responsible. However, they see that being defined, it can vary from person to person. But multiple studies have shown, especially in high level skilled positions, that those people are choosing companies. Yes, they want to be paid well and have good benefits, but they're often unwilling to work for a company with a poor environmental or social record, and they would pick a company with a good environmental social record over a competing offer. So that's it. Those are the big drivers. And I would ask you, what's yours? Because it's usually a combination of those, but you really should know what your number one business driver is for an ESG and sustainability program or strategy, even though there might be a mix. But I would send this to you and say, take a thought. If you do know 100%, or if you think you know, which of those is your top priority? Because that's how you build your strategy. No strategy should be off the shelf. It should be a strategy that meets the needs of the demand from the stakeholders, whether it's investors, scores, supply chain customers, consumers, employees, you say it, regulators, government agencies. So which is the number one business driver for you and your business? Got some good responses starting to come back. Right now, it looks like supply chain is the highest, which doesn't surprise me. There's a whole volume of businesses now starting to get impacted by these supply chain mandates and requests and disclosures. So I'll give it a few more seconds. But it is balancing out really well. What you see is not a lot of consumers here, consumer marketing companies that you're directly selling to consumers, because there's nobody saying that's their number one. And now we're starting to see a little bit of balance. All right, I'm going to send these results out to you so you can see them, but a nice balance. What's important is your answer for your company. So keep that in mind as we go through this, how you want to approach your strategy and assess how you're doing. But those drivers really provide 6 key challenges that every business is facing today with ESG and sustainability. 1, do you understand your existing and your potential investors' criteria for ESG and sustainability? Investors are a big lever, and they always will be. And then you understand who your business's other significant stakeholders are, what's their impact and influence on your company, and which issues do they feel you should be addressing. So non-investors, but still key stakeholders. Then understanding which topics and issues are material for your industry and your region so that you're not prioritizing the wrong things. Understanding which reporting frameworks and standards, if any, you should follow, because not every company should be following every framework and standard, and you really need to know which ones are relative and important to you. Finding a standardized approach to collecting, storing, managing, and disclosing ESG and sustainability data, perhaps for the first time. I think this is one of the most overlooked, and it's one of the probably areas that needs the most investment, and for people to see and leadership to understand that just like any business issue, if you believe it's material to your company, you have to have a data strategy, data collection, data storage, data management, analytics, and disclosure. Otherwise, you're not going to perform very well. And last is innovating and collaborating to find industry solutions to persistent global problems, because ESG and sustainability typically are tied to some large things that are not solved by one business within the four walls of its factory or office. These are larger problems, and if you care about them and see that they're affecting you, you typically have to innovate and get into some collaborative environment where you acknowledge that our company can't solve this. We need to be a part of some larger solution. And what does that look like? And that's a challenge. Businesses are not necessarily set up to collaborate outside, definitely not with competitors, but even within industry peers or cross industry, it's never simple. And so think about your organization. What's your number one challenge? What are you facing today when you're trying to adopt an ESG and sustainability strategy? Is it your investor criteria? Is it other key stakeholders? Is it your material issues and just understanding what those actually are? Is it the reporting frameworks and standards? Is it managing new ESG and sustainability data? Is it innovation and collaboration, or something else that we haven't even mentioned? So consider what is the number one thing stopping you or slowing you down and challenging you to adopt ESG and sustainability. I'll give everybody a few moments to think about that. Obviously, like before, there's usually a mix. It's never just one challenge, but typically you're able to identify what is the hardest thing that you're facing today. There we go. A lot on data, frameworks and standards, definitely. Some on innovation and collaboration. A good number of responses. I'll give it a moment because it does tend to even out. We start to see a little bit more even responses across the board. In about 5 more seconds, I'll send this out to everyone. Great. So there you can see these results. And I just want you to know, it's great to see the overall, but really for you, what's important is what was your answer? And then how do you address that challenge, because your strategy is what's most important to your business. And so let's jump into 3 aspects of an ESG and sustainability strategy that you need to think about. What are you assessing? Because you do need to assess these differently. Materiality is just, are we prioritizing the right things? Performance is, how are we doing now? So if we have those things, we still need to know how we're doing. Are we good, medium, best, really bad? And then capacity. What's our ability to improve over time? Do we have the resources in place? And what are those resources needed to achieve the future targets or whatever we're setting? So you really need to assess your materiality, your performance, and your capacity at a minimum, those 3 things. And I'm going to talk about materiality first. And if you're not familiar with this, the material just means your priority. It's material from a financial sense where it does impact your business, either directly or indirectly. And ESG, environmental, social, and governance, that it is just a holding. It's like 3 empty hangers in a closet. You have to hang the clothes in there. And which environmental issues are material to your business? Which social issues are material to your business? Which governance issues are material to your business? They should not look identical for every company. Industries start to take on a little bit of the similarity, but even each business is unique. So you'll often see this on the right. This is an image of a materiality matrix where they have scored and ranked different issues, and they've determined which ones are the highest and most prioritized, and that's the top right, the very high. Then there's a strip of high, and then moderate. And you're going to put the most attention to make sure your performance and your disclosure is most robust and most mature on the highest and most material issues. You should not try to manage every dot on this list. There's maybe 20 or 30. It's a terrible strategy, one that will not be executed well. But if you have 5 to 8 or 12, you're really actually going to be able to allow yourself as a company to create an effective strategy for the most important things. So it says here, there are so many framework standards and rating agencies and stakeholders. You should never make everyone happy, so you should not try. Material topics are most relevant to your industry and business. It's usually talking about impacting the business. So there is a term double materiality, depending on which way you want to go, but there's also the business impacting planet and society. That's more of a sustainability conversation. ESG is very directly like a risk management, quality management, impacting the business. How is it material to the business? ESG came out of the investor world, financial world. It is not that soft and fuzzy. Sustainability is more of the how do we help the planet? How do we help society? Identifying material topics requires benchmarking and stakeholder identification, assessment, and engagement to identify how you actually measure these and how you score them. So I'm going to just say this was a broad look. It's a visual image. I'm going to break down materiality assessment for you into several steps. But typically, people say materiality assessment. Have you done a materiality assessment? And we're going to talk about all the pieces that make those up, because there is not one version of a materiality assessment that exists. So I'll ask you, generally, has your organization conducted what you consider a formal materiality assessment? Definitely, if you've got a matrix and you've mapped out these issues, yes, you have at some level. But that doesn't mean you have to have that kind of an XY matrix for your organization. But if you've conducted any formal materiality assessment, you would probably find it in your annual report, or you would find it somewhere in your strategy presentations from your leadership. But typically that materiality assessment makes it into your annual report if you have done one. I'll give it a moment more. So we've got a lot of no's, a lot of I don't knows and yeses kind of balance themselves out. And I will say that I have seen a trend, which I personally don't like, but I understand from a marketing standpoint. After a few years, companies who have done a materiality assessment have pulled that out and don't continue to put all the background information. They might have an appendix or a link out to something in their website, but I've seen them start to take it out of the front end of the report because it does take up a few pages, and maybe they're just trying to be efficient. But it doesn't mean they haven't done one. So here are the results, a lot of no's, but a nice balance between yes and I don't know. Now we're going to break down the pieces of a materiality assessment. And so I'm going to give you as a company who does materiality assessments, I've also worked with lots of companies who have used other folks to do materiality assessments. These are the 5 pieces that are included. They're on the menu. Usually it's all or some of these types of benchmarking that are included. First is regulation. You really need to understand if there's a China market, Hong Kong, Brazil, the White House has rules and regulations. If you're in a region that there are government regulations, you need to include that in your materiality assessment, because being in compliance with federal laws or state and regional laws is absolutely material to your business. And so regulation needs to be something that you include. It's very important for multinational companies to understand the differing regulations, because it's complex enough to do ESG and sustainability, but then to try to have a company strategy that's different for different regions is not usually the best. Usually people try to find a lowest common denominator and have a strategy that can be implemented for the entire business that will satisfy all of their regulatory requirements. That's the most straightforward way. It also prevents you from having a lot of greenwashing claims against your organization, that you're doing something only for the regulation, but you're saying you're doing it for the good of the world. So regulation is absolutely the top of the list, but you can do that separately. You can do a regulatory benchmarking without a formal, broader materiality assessment, and everyone should be familiar with your regulatory ecosystem. Then there's the ESG ratings. They're not brand new, but they're matured for the reason you're seeing there's actually legal challenges out there now, because there are a lot of privately held companies, but for decades, many of them have been doing ESG ratings and complex algorithms, often proprietary complex algorithms, but they've been being pushed more and more into the transparency realm of saying you need to disclose and tell us not only what the algorithm is, why we were scored the way we are, but how to improve those scores. And that's what they all are starting to have in common these days, is that the rating agencies are becoming more, they're operated more and more almost like a quasi-governmental agency, because the market is demanding more transparency from them. But they're not the same. MSCI, DJSI, ISS, Sustainalytics, EcoVadis, their algorithms are not equivalent. And so you can get a good score in one, a poor score in the other, and then you have to go look and decide why you got the score and why they chose to weight some things differently for your business or your industry that others did not. I can tell you that really it's because capitalism and how it exists, these groups all started as a niche group for a particular set of investors. And then to increase their revenue, they grew over time and offered their services to more and more investors until they became international services. And so whatever they kind of the group that they started out with, there is some inherent bias. Those initial investor groups that they were serving valued certain things over others, and that kind of got baked into their algorithm. And they've slowly been changing those algorithms to be more in line with industry standards over time, but they all started somewhere different. They are different privately held companies, and that is true. And it's a valid criticism of the agencies themselves. So I'll back up really quick. You need to understand if you're rated by one or more of these agencies, then that's important and that's material to your business. You are going to have investor pressure and or lose or gain investors based on these ratings at some level, and you need to include that in your benchmarking. It's very important to understand those algorithms and the weighting of how you're scored. Standards and sometimes frameworks are very important. They're less performance-based, but they can still tell you what your material topics are. So the ESG standards, they break industries even into specific addendums. They'll have industry-specific standards that you can look at that are even more easy to pull, just a list of categories of things that you would want to be focused on. But all of them are aligning more than they've ever aligned before. Integrated reporting, TCFD and SASB have all kind of combined forces and been joined into IFRS recently. GRI, even though it's separate, is very much aligned with SASB and the IFRS standards, which are coming out. Actually, I think they might have just been released, but it's becoming international standard for all accounting that these ESG topics are going to be baked in and have the standards and frameworks available internationally, which is what people have been asking for. And those include material topics that you should be focused on. The Sustainable Development Goals are government, very focused on kind of government and kind of regional, national, state, and even municipal goals, but they do have a corporate angle to them. You can't align with the UN SDGs, and they're now bringing out this SDG impact kind of new system that's supposed to be tailored a lot more to the corporate world, but is typically they just have 17 specific goals. Each one of them is considered a material topic. So you could be focused on, social equality, or it could be water or climate. And they're basically organized into their material topics for you. And if you don't apply, if you're young, if you're new, if you're not publicly traded, if you're not in a region that has strong regulation, sometimes these standards are helpful, but it does not mean that you have to follow them. It's becoming a competitive thing to be in alignment, and definitely the investor community wants consistency in reporting, but that is really for the larger publicly traded companies. But you are seeing it being used as a competitive adoption where people say, well, it's sort of business as usual. We want to align with how everybody else is reporting, but it's not required for a lot of companies. And then benchmarking against your competitors. It's critical to look at your own industry because a large oil and gas company is not the same as a large or a small medium retailer of children's clothing. You're going to have very different material topics because your industry and your impacts are going to be different. So looking at your competitors, especially your direct competitors, is always valuable and needs to be included. And just seeing what kind of topics are they reporting on. You can also look at performance, which we'll talk about next, but just in the form of materiality, the topics get you in the ballpark. If someone's focused on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and then you see 7 other companies and your direct competitors all focused on it, and you're the only one not focused on it, then that just begs the conversation from your customers and your stakeholders. Why are you not caring about this? It seems to be an industry issue. So looking at those competitors directly is very important, not just leaning on the stakeholder materiality that is done, the standards and the frameworks. It's all multi-stakeholder. It's been done internationally. There's been a lot of engagement and involvement in those, but you should never adopt anything off the shelf. Like I said, you should always do your own. We have some questions. I think we're going to wait for those questions. Sorry, thank you. Nicole just sent me a message. I wanted to make sure I responded. So last is stakeholder engagement. And this is the piece that's really the hardest for most people. You can do a lot of that benchmarking of regulations, ratings, standards, and competitors. It's desk research. You cannot do stakeholder engagement as desk research. It is a customized weighting activity where you identify who your stakeholders are by name, by organization, and then you build a custom strategy to go out and engage with them. And it can be a focus group. It might end up being a series of phone call interviews. It could be one-on-ones that you kind of piggyback off of. You have a normal business meeting twice a year with them, so you just integrate that into your conversation. There's dozens of ways to do stakeholder engagement, and it needs to be appropriate. There are standards out there like AA 1000. There's actual standards to follow when doing stakeholder engagement because it's incredibly valuable, but it does include inherent risk. And anytime you engage with a set of stakeholders, even if it's just like your top 5 most impactful stakeholders, that you need to both capture opportunities, but you want to manage for risk. Make sure you're communicating clearly what they should expect and what they should not expect from you, because you're not able to make everyone happy, but you should still do engagement, is what I should say. Then you can get into actual performance. So just identifying which topics you should be focused on is one, but then how are you performing? Are you not good? Are you good? Are you great? Are you in compliance with regulations? Are you performing adequately for your investors? Are you performing adequately for your customers? How are you compared to your industry? How are you doing in the eyes of other key stakeholders? That's more specific, more deeper dive into looking at metrics, KPIs, targets, to actually see where you are in your maturity level, and are you at the top of the field, at the front of the pack, or are you at the back? And that does take a lot more work than just finding material topics and making sure you're prioritizing the right things. It becomes a resource issue of why are we performing where we are, but you have to know where you are. You have to be able to put yourself on a scale of 0 to 10 or first to last and know if you're good or if you're not good. And that does take work. We have something called the ESG Health Check. I'm not going to do a lot of marketing, but just to say, Materiality Assessment, we also do, but they're complex and they're long engagements. Sometimes they're expensive. They can spread over 6 months to a year, especially if you include stakeholder engagement. We can do a lot of shortcutting of that and just do the desk research as well as prep work for stakeholder engagement. And we try to really right-size that for companies. But it really comes down to what does your business want? And this is our version of right-sizing it for your company, doing something small and affordable, maybe for the first year. And then internal capacity. What resources do you have? Because once you know your topics and you've assessed your performance on a scale of good to bad, you do need to say, are we going to be able to maintain this for the future? Are we going to get better? Or are we actually in the process of getting worse? And you have to understand that internal capacity for yourself. What are your right long-term targets? You have to set goals if you want to improve. Can you maintain any of your good standing? That's actually critical. I usually bring up the topic of ESG ratings. They adjust over time, and those ratings, there's usually an absolute score, but they also score you on a scale within your industry to show where you're at in performing next to your peers. So if you just are happy and don't do anything, you will inevitably decline when it comes to your peers relative to your peer industry. And so it's not always just a maintenance and improve. It's a avoid dropping down, avoid getting worse in the eyes of all your stakeholders. How can you improve poor performance? How do you assign any qualified leadership? What does that mean? Who are the qualified leadership candidates? And have you allocated adequate resources? That's usually budget, but that's often training as well. Do you have the internal capacity to go anywhere? And a strategy is useless if you don't. And so that's the third piece of any strategy. And you do need to make a good assessment of whether these things are true and what is your capacity to make a difference. I'll say that we have training that we offer. We have video on demand, a prerequisite course called Foundation for ESG, but we also have a full day course for materiality and strategy, a full day course for management and execution, and a full day course for disclosure and communication. Those are coming up February 22nd through the 24th, but that video on demand is always available. You do have to take that before you can take the others. There's a lot of other great agencies if you want to take GRI training, SASB training, TCFD training. The only thing I would say is you need to know if that is the correct standard for you or if that's the correct driver for your company. And if you don't know that yet, it's really kind of premature to jump in and take a detailed, like becoming a GRI certified professional. Amazing training, but if you're not going to follow GRI as a company, a huge waste of your time and money. And so you do need to figure out what your drivers are for your business as you do that. And this is the assessment. You really need to understand all of this together, but material topics, you can find topics from all of these regulations, ratings, standards, competitors, and stakeholders, but you also then need to do a deeper dive and put yourself on a performance scale of bad to good in each of those sections, depending on which ones are the most important. But for internal capacity, you really need to understand if you have a good strategy, it has to have the right targets, the ability to maintain and improve performance, assigned leadership, and allocated resources. So all of that comes into how you assess your ESG and sustainability strategy. I went through pretty fast because I saw there were some questions coming in. So I wanted to jump to the questions piece, and I will jump in and just start answering those, and I can scroll back to any of the previous slides that you want. But hopefully I covered a lot of ground and created a lot of questions.
Adam, thank you for that great presentation. As he alluded to, we've already received several submitted questions, so we're going to jump right in. But I do ask as a reminder to please take that feedback form, or please complete the feedback form that will appear on your screen at the end of the webinar. All right. First up. Okay, is there a certificate program or certification in general, ESG or sustainability?
ESG and sustainability, typically, yes is the answer. We actually piloted and created one of the few, there's an ESG certification, but it's very advanced, it's very high level because it's very comprehensive. And so I think you'll get a PDF that includes information about that. It's really for companies that have gone down the path and done quite a bit, and you're certifying the entire program. That means you have to have done a lot of work because it's talking about each of these. It's certifying you have the right material topics, how is your performance in those topics, and do you have the capacity and targets to continue doing what you've said and claimed you're going to do. So I wouldn't try to start with an ESG broad certification. I would say that there are scoring methods, like EcoVadis is incredibly valuable, but it's usually valuable if you have a supply customer asking you to be in it because someone needs to look at it. But it does include its own survey tools and a scoring mechanism for you, where the other scoring agencies, they just score you they scrape public data and they score you mostly without your participation. That's not 100% true. There are some collaborative, like you can kind of submit information to them and say, hey, I think you missed something. But EcoVadis is a very great tool. It's not the only one out there, but it does provide you scores in different categories. And then you can actually share your scores with partners and business partners. But I would say most certifications actually fall into one of the categories: environmental, social, or governance. All the ISO standards pretty much sit squarely. Like ISO 14064 is a climate standard, or ISO 14000 is an environmental standard. ISO 50001, just an energy standard. They are ESG, they qualify, but only really as an environmental. And so ESG together, if you hear those letters in combination, you're really talking about a very high level look at a company. It's very strategic. And it's really, once you dive into a topic, you're getting into specific standards for that energy, water, or waste, or diversity, philanthropy, health and safety. Obviously with EHS, there's just going to be very specific social or environmental or governance standards that you need to know about all of them once you've determined that a topic is material. The larger standards that you see, you don't get a certification for GRI. You can have a compliant report. So some people do seek to have a GRI compliant report, and you can get that verified. We do sustainability report assurance. So you can verify by a third party that you have a SASB compliant report or that you have a TCFD compliant report. It's not a certification, but it's an assurance. It's a report assurance engagement. So they're just it's a different approach because of the high level nature of what ESG and sustainability is. It's a big umbrella term. Like I said, it's kind of like, think of it, 3 empty hangers in a closet. You haven't actually put your clothes in there yet. You have to figure out what you're going to hang up in the closet. It's kind of like a framework or a skeleton that you still have to fill in the blanks for.
Okay, great. Next question. Are companies coming up with ESG metrics that are at all consistent with the objectives and key results, OKRs, that John Durr shares in his 2021 book, Speed and Scale? And apologies if I butchered John's name pronunciation.
Well, I will tell you that I don't know the answer because I haven't read that book offhand, but I'll tell you that the most standards are not trying to align with any author's books. The standards themselves have standard setting bodies that follow standard setting protocols, and they do multi-stakeholder engagement within each industry. And so they're following a very transparent, a very public process to set their KPIs. And now all of them, like GRI, SASB, TCFD, they all basically have members of each other's boards crossing over, and they've been working for years to try to align their KPIs together. So they've never been more aligned. But I would say that John's book, I haven't read it, unless he's pulling from those standards and quoting them, then they probably don't. If he's kind of taking his own path, that's sort of what the industry is shying away from. They don't want any of these rogue things. They want more consistency. They want alignment. They want people to have the same approach. And so that's what I would say is follow the larger standard setting bodies. And that's where everything's heading.
All right. Next up, someone wants to know which department or departments within a company would typically send this out. I'm not sure what send refers to, but if you have an idea, feel free.
So I'll tell you that the governance structure is cross-department. And what's typical is that there's a senior ESG committee or a senior sustainability committee or a senior CSR committee. People call it whatever they want, senior social impact committee, but it's made up of senior leaders in the company and some special positions. There's legal, usually there's risk management, but you're making sure that you have individuals who have authority over that part of the company, and they determine at a very strategic high level what are the material topics. The group that does a materiality assessment and participates in that is a senior executive committee Sometimes they'll have a director of ESG or something like that within the committee as the coordinator who kind of manages it all and keeps it all in one place. But that's what you should be looking for. Governance, often one of the number one things in a governance category is, do you have a senior leadership committee that is determining what is material for the business and revisiting that strategy over and over again to make sure that things are still material and that you're choosing the right things to focus on. So hopefully that helps. The report itself gets sent out by the marketing, communications, and legal team. They're usually the ones who develop and write and edit the final ESG report.
Awesome. Okay, someone writes something I think we're all thinking. I think my org could really use an ESG assessment, but I anticipate potential internal pushback to, quote, airing dirty laundry, unquote. Is this something you've dealt with? And if so, do you have any advice on how to work around this?
It's a great question. Yes, we've dealt with it. What you should know is materiality assessments themselves can not be disclosed. You do not have to disclose, and that's why it's often, we call it, there's 5 steps in the sustainability journey on our other different webinars. The first 3 steps are when you do the materiality assessment, you provide education to your senior team, you do a materiality assessment, and then you set your strategy. You never have to disclose any of that, and it's often done quietly behind closed doors. Stakeholder engagement is often done with non-disclosure agreements. You're really trying to understand for yourself and your leadership team why you're going to focus on what you're doing, where your performance lies. Once you disclose externally, then you choose to do that. Once you publish a report, that's when you have the scrutiny. But often there is a delay, and people avoid putting too much out there until they actually have done the assessment. And some people wait a year or 2 and they've done some performance before they put a lot of information out there. And it's a risk management strategy. It's not always the best one, but if you're worried about that, just know that it's not a public event. It is not publicly disclosed. And when you choose to publicly disclose it, you choose how much to disclose. And some companies, like I said, don't put their materiality assessment within their report. And some don't disclose performance right away. But as soon as you start disclosing performance, you will naturally be compared to peers in your industry. So just know that that's the kickoff to when the real scrutiny starts to show up.
All right, next question. Is human capital, think occupational health and safety, included in materiality? And if so, how is that captured by metrics? And as kind of a side note, this person writes, hopefully that metric is not total recordable injury rate, a statistically invalid measure of health and safety performance.
You won't be happy because it does show up. You'll be happy that it's a universal. A lot of the social issues, human capital is a kind of a universal social issue. It's not always the same KPIs per industry, but TRIR is often thrown in the mix. But it comes down to health and safety. Often it's diversity, equity, inclusion is very popular. It's more of representation. And are you completely missing on some demographics that it doesn't make sense that you're not hiring anybody in those fields because like that's the country you work in. But there are, I would say, human capital in the social realm, you find a lot more universal metrics. Environmental ranges much more diverse because it's water could be number 1 and energy could not show up on the list, or climate could be number 1 and waste is nowhere to be seen. There's a lot more customization on the environmental side, but you typically do see community, like human rights, community giving, employee, like anything labor issues with employees, definitely health and safety, but also workers' rights, the right to organize and unionize, collective bargaining, things like that. But you'll see anyone who has a large supply chain sees a lot of human rights and supply chain management of human rights. Those KPIs, you can find them pretty easily in SASB specifically, and GRI have very aligned metrics. I think the World Economic Forum also has a list, but they just steal directly from GRI and SASB. But TRIR is one of those KPIs. It's not the only one, but it is one. Unfortunately, from your question, it is on the list almost every time.
All right, well, that's good to know. Someone wants to know, what is the status of the SEC regulations dealing with sustainability reporting? Have they been finalized?
Well, I'll tell you that SEC, from my knowledge, and this I think is this is very common, the SEC ruling is squarely about reporting on climate disclosures. It really is not an ESG or sustainability reporting ruling. And the process is, it was expected to possibly, I don't think anybody in the industry, we all knew that it was going to meet legal challenges, but those legal challenges will probably take all of this year. At the earliest, it could have been adopted last December, and it will probably be this December with changes. But it's going to be about climate disclosure, not anything else. And that's why in the US, we typically see a lot more greenhouse gas inventories, verifications of greenhouse gas inventories. Some folks are setting science-based targets and reporting to CDP, because that's the White House ruling for government contractors and government suppliers. But the SEC is not really tackling full-on sustainability reporting. It's very specific to just climate disclosure, if that helps. And if at the earliest, I think it'll be December if it gets approved this year.
Okay. So I have something that's pretty similar or goes hand in hand with what you've been talking about. So I'll ask that next. To what extent is climate change captured in companies' ESG efforts?
Say that again.
To what extent is climate change captured in companies' ESG efforts?
In broad, speaking very broadly, where it never is true in every case, climate is the number one issue internationally, not only for environmental, but ESG. It's at the top of everyone's list, because there are impacts already being seen across the supply chain, especially internationally. And it does carry with it social issues, displacement, things like that. And so it's very common. The climate disclosures have the most consistency and the most alignment all across the world. There's been more work on climate disclosure and aligning not only how you calculate those emissions, but how you set targets and how you verify. It's just been, it will continue to be the number one environmental issue, and it doesn't always come up in a materiality assessment as the number one issue for a particular company. And it can vary. And so you can find some where they don't have a huge energy or greenhouse gas or fuel footprint, and therefore they're focused on like hazardous waste, and climate is actually further down the list. But in broad strokes, on average, climate is the number one issue and has the most alignment, regulatory-wise, standards-wise, verification-wise, and it probably won't change. It's just kind of out there in the front.
All right, next question. What will you include in the governance piece of the G in ESG reporting? Would you include cyber and privacy or data protection under data protection risk?
Yes, some people do. You can argue about those things, but some people do put data security, especially if it's customer data security, customer privacy. They say it's a social issue, but it falls under governance. You'll have data, transparency, anti-corruption. You'll also just have a lot of structural government. It's a lot of governance structure. Like, do you have structures in place? What's the independence level of your board? What's the qualifications of your senior ESG committee? How do they integrate risk management into the ESG material? Decisions that they make. It's a lot of non-KPI type of disclosures, actually, where environmental and social are specific issues and the KPIs are such that you track over time. Governance is almost like it's not, but you can kind of think of it as almost like a checkbox in a lot of situations where the It's a disclosure of, are we doing this or are we not? And what is the structure that we have put in place? Sometimes there's actually discussions like an M&A version of discussion for a 10K report. It's like, give us a one paragraph discussion of your approach to risk management for ESG, things like that. So governance does have a little different feel to it, but there are ISO standards for data security, ISO standards for anti-corruption that do fall squarely in the G category.
Okay, great. What's one thing I can start doing today or tomorrow to improve our ESG strategy?
I think pick one thing, and if you want to start simple, I'll go back. And just to this list, you need to benchmark something. And if you've already done regulations, then go benchmark ratings. You've got to look at something to compare yourself to. And these are this is the short list that I would recommend. You don't have to do them all at once. Some companies do, especially the larger companies, but they have very large budgets and they have a lot more demands across international boundaries, pushing on them to achieve certain things. But I would go kind of line by line and do some sort of assessment and benchmarking of your program from one viewpoint. And ESG ratings are a very popular one. If you don't have any ratings, jump to the standards. They're really great because there's more alignment in the standards than anywhere else. The frameworks and standards that are out there, because they're public, they're not prescriptive. They just say, this is what you should measure and how you should measure it. And that's a good starting point, just to see if you're measuring the right things at all. And there's a lot less risk in that because you haven't moved into the performance phase where you're actually positioning yourself lower or higher than other people. But I would start with a benchmarking activity to see how you fare.
All right, perfect. Someone says, I like what you're saying, but I need to find a way to sell an ESG strategy to management and frontline workers. Do you have any suggestions for some quick wins to get buy-in and build momentum?
I mean, I would just say, this is self-serving, but I would say take a training. You've got to know, and this is a very common question when someone says, I need quick wins. The only way to understand where your quick wins are going to come from, I would be, you shouldn't trust me if I sat out here and just threw out a quick win without going through a detailed materiality assessment with you. But even if you understood the materiality assessment yourself and you got trained, you could go find those quick wins for yourself and then position them within what's called an ESG story. You would have to just reframe. And to be honest, you can reframe anything into an ESG strategy because all it is everything that's not measured with a dollar sign will fit into a social, environmental, or governance bucket because everything else has a dollar sign on it and is currency. There's financial reporting and non-financial reporting, and ESG is just an acronym for non-financial reporting. So you should take the training, you should get trained, and you should do some of the benchmarking yourself for your own company. And that's what's going to frame up your quick wins. And then you're going to be able to say, hey, that's just short term. This could grow into a medium-term strategy and a long-term strategy. And you would have to tie that to the different stakeholders and the drivers that meet your business. If I just said, oh yeah, do a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Well, 80% of the time that could be an easy answer and it might be right, but sometimes it's going to be wrong and it's not going to be helpful. So I'm not going to sit up here and try to lie to you about knowing exactly what your business should do. Do an assessment.
Okay. Someone says, I need to figure out a way to demonstrate value and ROI with little to no extra funding in my budget. Do you have any ideas for tools or strategies that don't cost much outside of my time and effort?
The quick answer, and this is broad enough where I feel like I can give it, most social issues are not direct. And even if they are direct, they're kind of soft. They're not as easy to just put dollar signs to, although they do have a direct correlation and you should learn how to measure it for your company. Environmental is a great entry point because you're measuring units of something, whether it's gallons of water or kilowatt of hours of electricity or pounds and tons of waste, it's usually a great place to start, especially if you're looking to just capture some continuous process improvement, efficiency wins that have a direct dollar sign that no one's going to be able to disagree with. Look for some environmental opportunities. It's usually like measure things that you haven't been measuring, do some analytics, try to identify some efficiencies. That's the easiest way to find cost savings, because some of the other stuff is not as direct as that. Not to say that you couldn't, but you really would need to go look at your industry and see to find how to justify those dollars and make them directly apply to the social changes that you're making. I would say HR is a great place to look. If you can measure training costs and the cost of high turnover or the cost of continuously retraining staff, or but it's not as easy, and a lot of HR departments are not set up well to directly correlate those savings to improvements in other parts of the company. So start environmental, maybe look at HR. If you got major safety issues and you're paying fines, but I'm going to assume that's not the case, that's another place to look. It's just major risk categories.
Awesome. Great. We have time for one more question. Someone writes, we're a small operation. We want to become more sustainable and focus on ESG, but some of the aspects you've touched on don't exactly apply. Do you have any suggestions on how to tailor our efforts or to find more resources that make sense for a small business? Privately owned, I assume.
Well, I'll say this, because ESG, we talk about ESG and sustainability, not synonymously, but in the same breath. But if you think of ESG, it's like the base of the pyramid. It's the foundational risk management and quality management components. It is not I'm going to be very blunt, ESG is not the feel-good stuff that people say it is. If you look at the ESG KPIs, there's nothing sexy or exciting about them. And they're also not going to inspire your employees and your customers. But you can build off of those, and you can take the next step. And sustainability type of topics are typically where you're moving out of do less harm into do more good. And you're really flipping it, and you're starting to do some of the positive outcomes type of work. And that's where sustainability lives. And it's sort of a continuum. So you could skip some of that if you don't have an ESG driver, if you don't have an investor demand or financial demand to report ESG specifically. You could just jump into, we want to save waste. We want to try zero waste in our office, or we want to install some solar panels. We want to, test some of the feel-good stuff that can also have a cost benefit, and you can have an ROI. But what often happens, you can establish like an ad hoc green team or a environmental working group, and just allow those people to do some of the stuff they're passionate about, that they're excited about, and then they can go look for some of these opportunities for you. But ESG typically is being driven by some much larger, more strategic parts of the company that definitely in the medium and long term are going to have a major impact on the business, where a green team may never turn into a strategic initiative for the company, but it still might be exciting and fun and make a difference. But it may not be core to your business strategy long term. So you can play in that arena, and it's perfectly acceptable. You just might never have the pressure to do more than that.
That's awesome. When you said green team, I immediately thought of like a bowling alley, or a bowling league with those really awesome T-shirts. It said green team on the back. Yeah, that'd be great.
You can get the swag out and appreciate your green team members with a bowling jersey.
All right. Thank you for a great presentation, Adam, and to our audience for such a lovely Q&A. Once again, I'd like to thank Adam Hammes and our sponsor, SGS North America, for making this all possible. On behalf of EHS Today, have a safe and healthy rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone.